So Sri Lanka is incredibly unstable because it is entirely dependent right now on the international community for basic needs. Currently, fuel is being rationed at petrol stations. Year on year, food inflation is estimated to be close to 50%. And of course, there are continuing power cuts and protests across the country, including trade union strikes, today a nationwide hartal. Peaceful protests are also being met with increasing state repression, protesters being arrested, tear gas and water cannons being deployed against them.
The finance minister has put out a pretty dire warning for Sri Lankans. Exactly what did he say in Parliament?
So Sri Lanka's newly appointed Finance Minister Ali Sabri told Parliament on Wednesday, May 4th, that the government had made historic mistakes. He attributed the crisis to economic policies implemented by the government, saying that the government should not have imposed tax cuts, that it should have approached the IMF earlier, that it should not have taken so long to restructure its debt. And critically, he also said that the country had less than $50 million in usable foreign reserves. For context, that is only enough to meet about a day or two of Sri Lanka's essential imports, food, fuel, and pharmaceuticals.
Pretty dire situation there. As you painted before, the country is incredibly reliant on international aid and support right now. Is there any economic relief from the IMF on the way?
So the finance minister also mentioned that an IMF program was still around 6 months away. In the interim, of course, Sri Lanka may receive some bridge financing and aid from the international community. India, for example, delivered 40,000 metric tons of petrol and promised more would follow. Bangladesh announced it would donate $2.3 million worth of essential medicines. But Sri Lanka won't really receive substantial loans or equity flows until it restructures its economy. But instead of focusing on these structural reforms that Sri Lanka so desperately needs, Parliament is actually squandering a lot of time over cheap measures to quell public discontent. Recently, we had about 148 MPs voting to re-elect the government-backed deputy speaker, and only 65 MPs actually voted for a true opposition candidate. Some spectators call this a government-backed delay tactic. Others say it was a method for the government to demonstrate that they had the confidence of the House, if not of the people. But in any case, after this vote, in which a majority of MPs actually stood behind a government-backed candidate, the public is beginning to lose faith in parliamentary solutions to their main demands.
Well, that does raise the point. The finance minister said that this economic crisis could last for 2 years. How do you foresee the next 2 years going then for the Prime Minister and the increasing protests that you mentioned earlier? How will the government continue to govern over 2 years if there's increasing discontent?
Well, financial crises around the world, wherever they've occurred, actually have very long-lasting impacts on asset prices, output, unemployment, and these impacts can actually last for around 5 or 6 years. In Sri Lanka, we're actually going back to the policy environment of 2017 in 2022, which is to say we've regressed for about 5 years, and these impacts could last for at least another 2 years from now. What we're seeing in Sri Lanka could be very much a lost decade. Protesters on their part have actually already recognized that the economic crisis is as much a result of poor economic policy as it is of poor politics, governance, and institutions, and that there's a need for accountability for the country to progress. So I don't think public anger is going to subside anytime soon, especially since the core demands of these protests, that the president and the prime minister resign, are not being met, and people are continuing to face the kinds of hardship that I described before. It's very likely, I think, that the protests will continue until these resignations occur or until there is a general election, at which time perhaps the current parliamentarians can be replaced by those who truly represent the demands being made by people.
What about the man at the top? What do protesters say about the Rajapaksa government and the Prime Minister? Could there be any movement at the top that could quell protesters and keep the government that has been in place for a while functioning at the same time?
Well, we've seen the main slogans of the protests being very much directed towards these top officers. The main slogans have been "Go home, Gota," and have also expanded to include the entire Rajapaksa family. So that is the main demand made by protesters. And I don't think unless those demands are met, that there will be a way to quell public protests. We've seen the government actually implement a lot of cosmetic changes. They've said that they would force the resignations of MPs in their cabinet, but we've seen these actually not lead to substantial change, as these MPs were simply reappointed back into cabinet. So I think that the public is quite wary now of these types of reforms, and won't really stop until they see some true accountability in the form of resignations, or again, as I mentioned before, in the form of replacing parliamentarians through a general election.
Amita Arud Pragasam, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me here.